There are few things more unsettling to the ordered mind than an empty chair at a dinner table, particularly when that chair belongs to the guest of honor. It was this peculiar circumstance that first drew my attention to what would become known as the Ashworth Manor affair, though at the time I was merely Captain Hastings, returned from Argentina with nothing more pressing on my mind than the prospect of a civilized English dinner party. The invitation had come from Lady Margaret Ashworth, a woman whose social gatherings were legendary for their combination of intellectual stimulation and exquisite hospitality. Ashworth Manor, nestled in the rolling hills of Kent, had been in the family for 3 centuries, and Lady Ashworth had maintained its reputation as a haven for the cultured elite of English society. The October evening was crisp and clear, with the first hint of winter's approach lending an air of melancholy beauty to the ancient oak trees that lined the manor's sweeping drive. I arrived precisely at 7:30, as was proper, to find the drawing-room already populated with a fascinating collection of individuals. Lady Ashworth herself, a woman of 60 with the bearing of one accustomed to command, greeted me warmly. Her husband, Lord Ashworth, a distinguished gentleman whose wealth derived from both inherited lands and shrewd investments in the railways, stood near the magnificent fireplace engaged in animated conversation with Sir Geoffrey Thorne, a rising star in the Foreign Office whose sharp wit was matched only by his political ambitions. The assembled company, the other guests, formed an intriguing tableau of English society. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the family physician for more than 20 years, possessed the gentle authority that comes from a lifetime of attending to both the physical and emotional ailments of the upper classes. His weathered hands and kind eyes spoke of countless midnight calls and whispered confidences. Miss Helena Fairfax, a young woman of perhaps 28, had been introduced as the personal secretary to the evening's most anticipated guest. Her nervous energy and the slight tremor in her hands as she sipped her sherry suggested she carried burdens beyond her apparent station. Charles Pemberton, Lady Ashworth's nephew and heir, cut a somewhat dissolute figure despite his expensive tailoring. At 35, he possessed the soft features of a man who had never known true hardship, yet there was something in his manner, a furtive quality to his glances, that suggested hidden anxieties. His wife Constance presented a study in controlled elegance, her dark beauty marred only by an expression of perpetual calculation, as though she were forever weighing the social and financial advantages of every interaction. Professor Alistair Finch, the renowned archaeologist whose recent discoveries in Egypt had captivated the nation, stood somewhat apart from the others. His intense gaze and scholarly bearing marked him as a man more comfortable with ancient mysteries than modern social conventions. Yet it was clear that his presence at the gathering was not merely academic. His eyes followed the movements of others with the careful attention of one accustomed to reading significance in the smallest details. The missing guest. The focal point of much anticipation, however, was the conspicuous absence of Mrs. Evelyn Reed. Even those unfamiliar with London society would have recognized her name from the society pages, where her unconventional lifestyle and considerable inherited wealth made her a frequent subject of speculation. A widow of 38, she had scandalized and fascinated polite society in equal measure with her independent spirit. Her patronage of controversial artists, and her rumored romantic entanglements with figures both prominent and unsuitable. "Mrs. Reed sends her apologies for the delay," Lady Ashworth announced as we gathered for cocktails. "Her motor car encountered some difficulty on the London road, but she assures me she will arrive presently. We shall proceed with our usual schedule." As the grandfather clock chimed 8, signaling the dinner hour, a subtle tension began to permeate the drawing-room. Mrs. Reed's dramatic entrances were legendary, but even by her standards, this delay was becoming noteworthy. The carefully orchestrated conversation continued, yet I observed how frequently eyes turned toward the entrance hall, how often ears seemed to strain for the sound of an arriving vehicle. The dinner summons, "Hey!" When the butler, a dignified man named Pembleton, who had served the family for over 30 years, announced that dinner was served, we processed to the dining room with a measured dignity appropriate to our station. The long mahogany table gleamed under the soft light of crystal chandeliers, each place setting arranged with mathematical precision. The empty chair to Lady Ashworth's right seemed to dominate the room despite, or perhaps because of, its vacancy. "We shall begin," Lord Ashworth declared after several minutes of polite delay. "Mrs. Reed would not wish us to spoil cook's efforts on her account." The first course, a delicate consommé garnished with herbs from the manor's own gardens, was served with the usual efficiency. Yet the conversation, typically flowing as smoothly as fine wine, seemed to catch and stumble. Miss Fairfax appeared increasingly agitated, her spoon trembling slightly as she attempted to maintain composure. Charles Pemberton drank more wine than was strictly appropriate, while his wife Constance maintained her mask of cool observation. It was Professor Finch who first voiced what we were all beginning to suspect. "This is most unlike Mrs. Reed," he observed quietly. "In my experience, she is punctilious about her social obligations, whatever her reputation might suggest to the contrary." Dr. Hartwell nodded gravely. "Indeed, I have attended her on several occasions, and she has never struck me as one to cause unnecessary worry to her hosts." The discovery. As if summoned by our growing concern, young Mary, one of the housemaids, appeared at the dining-room entrance. Her face was pale, and her usual composure had entirely deserted her. "Begging your pardon, my lady," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Mrs. Reed, she's not in her room, my lady. Her things are there, her evening gown laid out as she requested, but the window is standing wide open, and there's—" She faltered, her eyes wide with fear. Lady Ashworth rose immediately, her training in household management overcoming her social instincts. "What is it, Mary? Speak plainly." "There's blood on the windowsill, my lady. Just a few drops, but it's fresh." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. In that moment, the comfortable world of dinner parties and social pleasantries cracked like thin ice, revealing the dark waters beneath. Mrs. Evelyn Reed, the woman who had been expected to grace our table with her notorious charm and wit, had vanished into the October night, leaving behind only the mystery of an open window and the ominous suggestion of violence. As we sat frozen in that tableau of shocked gentility, I found myself thinking of my old friend, the meticulous Belgian detective whose understanding of human nature had so often illuminated the darkest corners of criminal behavior. How I wished that Hercule Poirot were present to apply his remarkable powers of observation to this most perplexing disappearance. The woman who never took her seat at dinner had, it seemed, departed Ashworth Manor by means both mysterious and potentially sinister, leaving us to grapple with questions that would soon require the intervention of a mind far more acute than any present in that stunned dining-room. The transformation of our genteel dinner party into a scene of potential crime occurred with the swift efficiency that only genuine crisis can produce. Lady Ashworth, displaying the commanding presence that had made her a formidable hostess for 3 decades, immediately took charge of the situation with admirable composure. "No one is to leave the premises," she announced with quiet authority, her voice cutting through the murmur of shocked conversation. "Pembleton, send word to the local constabulary at once. Dr. Hartwell, if you would be so kind as to examine the room, your medical expertise may prove invaluable." The crime scene. Revealed. Mrs. Reed's guest room, located on the ground floor for convenience, presented a tableau that was both mundane and deeply unsettling. The chamber itself showed no signs of struggle. Her traveling cases remained neatly arranged, evening jewelry displayed openly on the dressing table, and her silk gown spread carefully across the bed as though awaiting its owner's return. The window, however, told an entirely different story. The casement stood wide open to the October night, and the stone sill bore unmistakable traces of what Dr. Hartwell confirmed to be fresh human blood. More disturbing still, several threads of dark fabric clung to the window's lower edge, suggesting that someone had passed through the opening under circumstances violent enough to tear their clothing. "The blood is no more than an hour old," Dr. Hartwell reported quietly, his weathered hands steady despite the shocking circumstances. "A laceration rather than a severe wound, but the pattern suggests some degree of force or haste." Professor Finch, his archaeological training evident in his methodical approach, noted additional details that proved crucial. "The window opens outward," he observed, "which would make entry from outside extremely difficult without leaving clear evidence on the exterior stonework. Yet I see no such marks." Revealing reactions. The responses of our fellow guests proved as illuminating as the physical evidence. Miss Fairfax had grown increasingly distraught, clutching her leather portfolio as though it contained her most precious possessions. Her earlier nervousness had transformed into something approaching genuine anguish. "Mrs. Reed was very particular about her evening preparations," she murmured, her voice trembling. "She would never have left the window open in such weather, and she was expecting—" She stopped abruptly, as though catching herself before revealing too much. Charles Pemberton, his consumption of wine clearly affecting his judgment, made several inappropriate remarks about Mrs. Reed's theatrical tendencies before his wife silenced him with a withering look. Constance herself maintained her composed exterior, though I observed how her fingers worried constantly at her pearl necklace, and her eyes took in every detail with clinical precision. The burned letter. It was Miss Fairfax who provided our first substantial clue, though seemingly without intention. "There was a letter," she said suddenly, her composure cracking entirely. "Among the afternoon post. She read it and burned it in the grate immediately before I could see the handwriting. She seemed disturbed by its contents. We examined the fireplace, but only charred fragments remained. Nothing legible survived Mrs. Reed's thorough destruction of the correspondence." Official intervention. The local constabulary arrived within the hour, led by Inspector Morrison, whose experience with rural crime had not prepared him for the complexities of a potential abduction among the upper classes. His examination was thorough but conventional, focusing on obvious physical evidence while missing the psychological undercurrents that were becoming increasingly apparent. "Most likely," Inspector Morrison announced after his preliminary investigation, "Mrs. Reed received urgent communication requiring immediate departure. The blood could result from a minor accident while climbing through the window." This superficial assessment failed to account for numerous troubling inconsistencies. Why would a woman of Mrs. Reed's standing depart through a window rather than requesting her motor car? Where was this urgent message, and why abandon valuable jewelry if departure was voluntary? The arrival of expertise. As the evening wore on and the search of the grounds proved fruitless, I found myself increasingly convinced that we required assistance far beyond local capabilities. It was nearly midnight when salvation arrived in an unexpected form, the distinctive sound of a motor car navigating the Manor's drive with unusual precision. The small, precise figure that emerged from the vehicle was immediately recognizable. Hercule Poirot, summoned by my urgent telephone call, had arrived to apply his remarkable powers of observation to our perplexing mystery. "Mon ami Hastings," he said, his keen eyes already cataloguing details others had missed, "we are in the middle of something most interesting, I perceive." His gaze swept the assembled faces with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to reading human nature in all its complexity. Within moments of examining Mrs. Reed's room, Poirot had identified elements that had escaped even Dr. Hartwell's medical eye. "A room prepared for an evening that never came," he murmured. "A window opened not for air, but for departure, or perhaps for the suggestion of departure. The blood placed where it will certainly be seen. We do not begin with accident, mes amis. We begin with intention." The woman who never took her seat at dinner had left behind more than an empty chair. She had left us a puzzle that would require all of Poirot's legendary skills to solve. The transformation of our drawing room into an impromptu headquarters for criminal investigation occurred with the quiet efficiency that only Hercule Poirot could command. Lady Ashworth, accustomed to directing the most complex social gatherings, found herself deferring to the small Belgian detective whose reputation preceded him like a shadow of certainty in our suddenly uncertain world. Poirot assumes command. "If you will permit, madame," Poirot said with his characteristic small bow, "we shall proceed with method. No one leaves the premises, no telephone calls except to the authorities. We keep what I call the closed circle. It is like the little theatre, you comprehend. In the big theatre, one loses the essential drama." Inspector Morrison, clearly uncomfortable with this usurpation of his authority, nevertheless recognized superior expertise when confronted with it. Poirot arranged us in the morning room with the precision of a conductor positioning his orchestra, each person placed where he could observe their reactions most effectively. The timeline. Contradiction. "First," Poirot announced, settling into his chair as though it had been designed specifically for his small, precise frame, "we establish what the English call the timetable. Mademoiselle Fairfax, you are the secretary to Madame Reed. You will be so good as to tell us of her movements today." Miss Fairfax, still clutching her leather portfolio like a lifeline, began with visible effort to compose herself. "Mrs. Reed and I arrived at Ashworth Manor at 4:30 this afternoon. We had travelled directly from London in her motor car, which was to return for us at 7:15 to take us back to town after dinner." Lady Ashworth's expression shifted from attention to confusion. "But Miss Fairfax, surely you are mistaken. Pembleton received a telephone message at 7 o'clock stating that Mrs. Reed's motor had broken down on the London road. That is precisely what I announced to our guests." The silence that followed this contradiction was profound. Poirot's eyebrows rose with the delicate precision of a man who has just discovered the first loose thread in a carefully woven tapestry. "Ah," he murmured, his green eyes brightening with interest. "So there was a message. Pembleton, you will tell us exactly what occurred." The false message revealed. The butler, clearly distressed at finding himself central to the investigation, cleared his throat nervously. "The telephone rang at 7:07, sir. Mary answered it in the servants' hall and brought the message to me. A gentleman's voice," she said, apologizing on behalf of Mrs. Reed's chauffeur for a mechanical delay on the London road. Miss Fairfax shook her head vehemently. "That cannot be correct. We were already here. Mrs. Reed had changed her mind about dressing immediately. She wished to attend to correspondence first. I left her jewelry case in her room at 5:45 and saw her last at 5 o'clock in the long gallery." Poirot steepled his fingers, his expression one of intense concentration, most illuminating. "We have here what I call the deliberate misdirection. Someone wishes us to believe that Madame Reed was delayed on the road, when in fact she was already in residence. This false message, it serves a purpose. It provides explanation for her absence from dinner while concealing the true reason for that absence. Systematic character analysis." With methodical precision, Poirot began his examination of each member of our company. His questions appeared casual, almost conversational, yet I recognized the careful psychological probing that had solved so many seemingly impossible cases. To Dr. Hartwell. "You have been the family physician for many years, Doctor. Did you know Mrs. Reed well?" "I attended her on several occasions," the elderly physician replied carefully. "She was fundamentally healthy, though she had been under some strain recently. She spoke of old ghosts returning to trouble her." To Professor Finch. "Your acquaintance with Mrs. Reed was professional, I understand?" "She was a generous patron of archaeological research," Finch confirmed. We were to discuss a significant investment this very evening, a major excavation that required substantial capital. To Charles Pemberton, whose earlier intoxication had given way to nervous sobriety. You knew Mrs. Reed socially. Charles exchanged a quick, meaningful glance with his wife before answering. We moved in similar circles. She was a remarkable woman, though unconventional in her methods. The financial revelations. It was when Poirot turned his attention to Miss Fairfax that the most significant revelations emerged. Under his gentle but persistent questioning, the young woman's composure finally cracked entirely. She had been different lately, Miss Fairfax admitted, tears beginning to flow. Secretive, anxious. She received several letters that she destroyed immediately, always burning them completely. She spoke of settling old debts and putting things right, but would never elaborate on what she meant. And her financial arrangements? Poirot inquired with infinite patience. That's what worried me most, Miss Fairfax confessed. She had been making unusual changes, large withdrawals from her bank accounts, alterations to her will. She met with her solicitor 3 times last month, always insisting on complete privacy. I began to fear she was being blackmailed, or worse. The staged disappearance theory. Returning to Mrs. Reed's room, Poirot conducted what could only be described as a masterclass in deductive observation. His small hands moved with surgical precision as he examined each element of the scene. Observe, mes amis, he said, gesturing toward the dressing table. The jewelry displayed openly, emeralds, diamonds, pearls worth a fortune. If departure was urgent, why leave such easily portable wealth? If departure was forced, why did the abductor ignore such obvious prizes? He moved to the window, examining the blood traces and fabric threads with intense concentration. A few drops of blood, placed precisely where the housemaid must discover them. Threads from a coarse wool garment, not from Madame Reed's fine traveling costume. These are not the accidents of hasty departure. They are the carefully arranged props of deliberate deception. The psychological revelation. As the clock struck 3 in the morning, Poirot gathered us once more in the drawing-room. His manner had grown more serious, the theatrical elements of his personality replaced by quiet, inexorable authority. "We have here," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "not a mysterious disappearance, but a carefully orchestrated charade. A woman does not abandon valuable jewelry to climb through windows when doors are available. She does not leave behind the trappings of wealth while fleeing in supposed terror. This entire scene, the open window, the blood, the torn fabric, has been arranged with meticulous care to create a specific impression." He paused, allowing his words to settle before delivering the most chilling observation of all. "But most significant of all, mes amis, is this. Madame Reed arranged to disappear from a house where every person present had reason to wish her gone. The generous patron whose investments had strings attached, the wealthy widow whose will was being altered, the woman who knew secrets that others wished to remain buried. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. In that moment, each of us realized that we were not merely witnesses to a puzzling disappearance. We were suspects in what was rapidly revealing itself to be a crime of extraordinary complexity and calculation. The woman who never took her seat at dinner had not vanished into the October night. She had, with methodical precision, arranged for us to believe she had vanished, while the truth remained hidden beneath layers of misdirection that only Hercule Poirot's remarkable mind could begin to penetrate. The morning light filtering through Ashworth Manor's mullioned windows revealed a household transformed by crisis, yet it was precisely this transformation that allowed Hercule Poirot to impose his methodical order upon chaos. He had established himself in Lord Ashworth's study, arranging the interview schedule with the precision of a conductor organizing his orchestra, each suspect summoned to face his penetrating analysis in carefully calculated sequence. The methodical timeline. We begin, as always, with order. Poirot announced, his small hands arranging his notebook with mathematical precision. "Each person will account for their movements between 5 o'clock and 8 yesterday evening. It is in these ordinary moments, mes amis, that human beings betray themselves through the smallest asymmetries." The timeline that emerged revealed a household in which everyone had been curiously mobile during the crucial hours. Lady Ashworth claimed to have been reviewing dinner arrangements until 5:30, then retreating to her dressing room. Lord Ashworth corroborated her account while placing himself in the library with Sir Geoffrey Thorne. Yet Poirot's keen eye noted the slight hesitation before each response, the careful coordination of stories that suggested prior consultation. The individual revelations, Dr. Hartwell, despite his professional composure, revealed the most disturbing information about Mrs. Reed's recent state of mind. "She spoke of feeling watched, almost haunted," he confided, his weathered hands steady despite the shocking circumstances. "She mentioned old ghosts returning and seemed convinced that a past indiscretion, long buried, was about to resurface. The anxiety was palpable, though she remained vague about specifics." Professor Finch's interview proved particularly illuminating, though not in the manner one might expect. Under Poirot's patient questioning, the distinguished archaeologist revealed tensions that transformed our understanding of his relationship with the missing woman. Mrs. Reed's patronage had become complicated, Finch admitted, his scholarly composure beginning to crack. "She had invested heavily in my Egyptian excavations, but recently began demanding access to artifacts rightfully belonging to the Cairo Museum. When I refused, she threatened to withdraw funding and expose what she claimed were irregularities in my financial reporting." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "And these irregularities, Professor?" "Completely unfounded accusations," Finch replied hastily. Mrs. Reed had developed an obsession with ancient burial practices. She believed she had identified an undiscovered royal tomb. Her demands became increasingly unreasonable, her behavior more erratic. The financial web revealed. Charles Pemberton's examination exposed the desperate financial straits that had made him vulnerable to Mrs. Reed's influence. His hands trembled as he attempted to light a cigarette, the very picture of a man whose nerves had been stretched beyond endurance. "She was helping us through a temporary difficulty," he stammered. "A loan to cover some unfortunate gambling debts. £20,000, quite reasonable terms initially. But recently she had begun demanding immediate repayment, threatening to expose our situation to the family if we could not comply." His wife Constance presented a stark contrast, cool, calculating, and possessed of considerable intelligence concealed behind social propriety. Mrs. Reed had a talent for discovering people's vulnerabilities, she observed with clinical detachment. She collected secrets the way other women collect jewelry, not necessarily to use them, but to possess the power they represented. The secretary's crucial testimony. Miss Fairfax's second interview proved the most emotionally charged and revealing. Under Poirot's gentle persistence, she disclosed information that fundamentally altered our understanding of the previous evening's events. "She was expecting someone," Miss Fairfax confessed through tears. "A visitor from her past. She made me promise not to tell anyone, but she seemed genuinely frightened. She even changed her mind about her evening dress, saying she needed to look unapproachable for this person." More significantly, she revealed Mrs. Reed's intended announcement. She planned to speak after dinner about establishing a trust, not just for Professor Finch's expedition, but to make restitution to someone she had wronged. Her exact words were about settling old scores and making amends before it was too late. The physical evidence reconsidered. Returning to Mrs. Reed's room, Poirot conducted a more thorough examination that revealed the theatrical nature of the supposed crime scene. His discoveries were both illuminating and deeply disturbing. "Observe, Hastings," he said, indicating subtle details that had escaped earlier notice. The blood on the windowsill forms a pattern inconsistent with someone climbing through. It has been placed deliberately, as though dripped from above. The fabric threads, they are from coarse wool, yet Mrs. Reed's traveling costume was silk and fine wool. Moving to the dressing table, he examined the jewelry with intense concentration. And here, the most revealing evidence of all. These emeralds. They are paste, excellent imitations, but worthless. The real stones have been replaced, probably within recent days. A woman preparing to disappear does not leave valuable jewelry behind, but she might leave convincing replicas to support an illusion. The false lead emerges. Inspector Morrison's return with evidence seemingly implicating Professor Finch created the classic Christie moment of false resolution. A witness had seen a tall gentleman in a dark coat at the village call box at 7 o'clock, precisely when the false message about Mrs. Reed's delayed arrival had been placed. Thread matching Finch's overcoat had been found on the window frame. The case appears straightforward, Inspector Morrison announced with satisfaction. Professor Finch, facing financial ruin and exposure, eliminated his tormentor and staged the disappearance. Yet Poirot's response was characteristically dismissive of such obvious solutions. Non, non, Inspector. Do not let us be children who applaud the conjurer's first trick. The thread tells us only that someone procured fabric similar to what a gentleman might wear. The call from the village tells us the deceiver wishes us to believe in the chauffeur's delay. These are flourishes, smoke, theatrical gestures designed to misdirect our attention. The psychological insight. As Professor Finch was led away under suspicion, Poirot's expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "It is too obvious, mon ami," he murmured to me as we stood alone in the study. A man of Professor Finch's intelligence and precision would not create such a crude deception. This smells of haste and fear, but not his haste. Not his fear. He moved to the mantelpiece, adjusting the clock and ornaments until perfect symmetry was achieved. Order reveals the soul, Hastings. In this crime, it is the work of a disordered mind attempting to create order through misdirection. Someone has painted for us a portrait of the scholarly gentleman driven to desperation, but the brush strokes are too bold, too obvious. The emerging truth. As the morning progressed, Poirot's methodical questioning had revealed a web of financial dependencies, hidden resentments, and dangerous secrets that transformed our understanding of Mrs. Reed's position. She had not been merely a wealthy patron and social figure. She had been a woman wielding considerable power over desperate people through her knowledge of their secrets and control of their financial destinies. "We begin to see the true picture," Poirot announced with quiet certainty. Mrs. Reed had created a situation where multiple individuals had compelling motives to wish her gone. But more significantly, she had arranged to make restitution, to settle old scores. Someone could not allow that settlement to occur. The woman who never took her seat at dinner had not vanished into the October night as we had been led to believe. She had, with methodical precision, arranged the appearance of disappearance while remaining hidden within our closed circle. But her plan, whatever its ultimate purpose, had gone terribly wrong, leaving us to unravel not a mysterious vanishing, but a murder disguised as a disappearance, with the most obvious suspect serving as an elaborate misdirection from the true killer's identity. As the shadows lengthened across the ancient stones of Ashworth Manor, Poirot's little grey cells had begun to perceive the psychological landscape that would lead to the truth. A truth that lay not in physical evidence or obvious motives, but in the complex interplay of human nature, desperation, and the terrible lengths to which people will go to protect their carefully constructed lives from exposure. The afternoon brought with it a curious transformation in Hercule Poirot's approach to our increasingly complex mystery. Where the morning had been devoted to methodical interviews and physical evidence, he now embarked upon what could only be described as a campaign of psychological warfare, conducted with the precision of a master strategist and the subtlety of a skilled diplomat. The empty chair, gambit. "We shall take luncheon in the smaller dining room." Poirot announced with deceptive casualness. "And we shall maintain all the courtesies, including a place for our absent hostess." The effect was calculated and devastating. Mrs. Reed's chair was laid with mathematical precision, crystal glass charged with wine, napkin folded to perfection, silver gleaming in the autumn light streaming through the windows. The empty seat dominated our small gathering like a silent accusation, transforming what should have been a simple meal into an exercise in collective discomfort. Conversation died in half-formed sentences. Even the usually unflappable Pemberton contrived to rattle a serving spoon against the soup tureen. Miss Fairfax barely touched her food, her eyes drawn repeatedly to the vacant chair as though expecting Mrs. Reed to materialize at any moment. Charles Pemberton consumed wine with unseemly haste, while his wife Constance maintained her mask of composure, though I observed how her fingers worked continuously at her pearl necklace. "We shall play a small game," Poirot announced softly, allowing the silence to achieve its maximum effect. "It is the game of truth, but conducted with civility rather than the crude instruments of official investigation. I ask only the smallest cooperation from each of you. The language of deception." Turning first to Pemberton, Poirot requested the exact repetition of the previous evening's telephone message. The butler, glancing toward Lady Ashworth for permission, recited with the precision of a man accustomed to accuracy. "The chauffeur begs to inform your ladyship that Mrs. Reed's motor has suffered a mechanical difficulty on the London road, and he fears delay." Poirot's head tilted with the attention of a musician detecting a false note. "The words, they are most significant," he observed. "A chauffeur speaks of practical matters. The car has broken down. We're stuck near Tunbridge." He does not employ phrases like mechanical difficulty or speak of the London road in such formal terms. This is the language of education, of maps rather than experience. He then conducted what appeared to be a parlor game, requesting each of us to phrase such a message in our own words. The results were illuminating. Lady Ashworth produced crisp efficiency. Dr. Hartwell offered gentle apology. Charles stumbled through attempted jauntiness, and Constance delivered elegant economy. Miss Fairfax could barely speak. When Sir Geoffrey's turn arrived, he smiled with practiced political charm. "I should say there has been a mishap to the motor on the London road. Pray accept our apologies." "Precisely so," Poirot murmured. "On the London road." The phrase hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. The systematic unraveling. Sir Geoffrey's composure, polished by years of diplomatic training, began to show hairline cracks. "If you imply, I observe," Poirot corrected with maddening mildness. "The library window facing the east lawn was unlatched at 7:05 yesterday evening, and latched again at 10 past. A gentleman in smooth-soled shoes left the faintest impression on the exterior stone. Only one person here wears such formal footwear consistently." The revelation that followed, extracted with Poirot's characteristic patience, painted a picture of Sir Geoffrey's complicity in Mrs. Reed's deception. Under persistent questioning, he admitted to placing the false telephone call at Mrs. Reed's request, part of what he had believed to be an elaborate social maneuver to avoid the vulgarity of a late entrance. She spoke of clearing slates and settling accounts, Sir Geoffrey confessed, his political armor finally cracking. I assumed it was merely her dramatic way of describing some trivial social matter. She enjoyed having power over people, collecting their small secrets like trophies. The jewelry revelation. Poirot's next move demonstrated his thorough preparation. A telegram arrived, which he handed without comment to Constance Pemberton. Her reaction, the slightest tightening around her mouth, the whitening of her fingers on the paper, spoke volumes about its contents. "A correction from a Bond Street jeweler," Poirot explained with deceptive casualness. "The emeralds Mrs. Reed left upon her dressing table are paste, expertly crafted, completed last month. Someone ordered them on short notice, paying in cash to avoid documentation. Such arrangements leave ripples in the world of commerce. Constance's cool facade wavered for the first time. If they were paste, that suggests Mrs. Reed's intention to deceive, not mine. It suggests intention. Poirot agreed blandly. The question remains whose intention we are discussing. The planted evidence exposed. The afternoon's most damning revelation concerned the thread allegedly from Professor Finch's overcoat. Poirot's examination had revealed that the thread had been deliberately clipped from the garment while it hung in the cloakroom, precise work requiring steady hands and familiarity with needle and thread. "This is not the careless evidence of a panicked killer," Poirot observed, his voice carrying new steel. "This is the calculated improvement of a story by someone with both opportunity and the temperament for such delicate deception." His gaze passed meaningfully over our assembled company, noting those with the skills and access necessary for such manipulation. The implications hung heavy in the afternoon air. Someone among us had not merely committed murder, but had systematically attempted to frame an innocent man. The psychological pressure intensifies. As the day progressed, Poirot orchestrated a series of seemingly casual encounters, afternoon tea that became an examination of guilty consciences, a chess game with Lord Ashworth that explored the psychology of strategic deception, quiet conversations that probed the boundaries of each person's carefully constructed alibis. Miss Fairfax grew increasingly agitated, her earlier distress transforming into something approaching desperation. Her portfolio, which she clutched like a shield, clearly contained information she dared not reveal. Charles Pemberton's drinking increased proportionally to his anxiety, while his wife's composure became more brittle with each passing hour. "The walls are closing," Poirot announced as evening approached, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "The police remain satisfied with their convenient professor, but I am not. Someone here has built an elaborate edifice of misdirection, the false message, the planted evidence, the theatrical staging of disappearance. This person is intelligent, methodical, and growing desperate." He paused, allowing his warning to settle over our small company like a shroud. "I advise extreme caution. A killer who has planned with such precision will not hesitate to eliminate any threat to their carefully constructed deception. No one should walk alone, accept food or drink from unexpected sources, or turn their back on an unlocked door." The gathering storm, as the shadows lengthened across Ashworth Manor's ancient stones, the psychological pressure Poirot had so carefully orchestrated, began to show its effects. Fear moved among us like a living thing, transforming social courtesies into suspicious glances, reducing civilized conversation to nervous whispers. The woman who never took her seat at dinner had left behind more than an empty chair. She had created a puzzle that was systematically destroying the comfortable assumptions of everyone present. Each revelation stripped away another layer of deception. Each question exposed another carefully hidden truth. Poirot's little grey cells had begun their inexorable work, and I knew with growing certainty that the next 24 hours would bring either complete resolution or tragic escalation. The killer, whoever they might be, was being driven toward a corner from which there could be no escape save through violence or confession. The game of psychological chess that Hercule Poirot had initiated was approaching its critical phase, and the next move would determine whether justice would be served through revelation or whether desperate measures would claim another victim in this increasingly deadly affair at Ashworth Manor. The evening's oppressive atmosphere had transformed Ashworth Manor into a pressure cooker of barely contained anxiety, with Poirot's psychological campaign having achieved its intended effect. Fear moved among our small company like a living entity, transforming polite social interactions into exercises in mutual suspicion. It was precisely this heightened state of tension that made the night's discovery both inevitable and devastating. The midnight summons. The disturbance came not as a dramatic scream piercing the night, but as the measured footsteps of Pemberton ascending the main staircase at 11:30. His usual composure had cracked sufficiently to reveal genuine distress as he knocked softly at the door of Poirot's guest room. "Monsieur Poirot," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of terrible news. "I fear we have found Mrs. Reed. The head gardener discovered something in the old ice house while securing the grounds for the night. Inspector Morrison requests your immediate attendance." The ice house, a relic from the manor's earlier centuries, stood partially buried in the earth beyond the formal gardens. Its heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands and typically secured with an ancient lock, hung open like a mouth frozen in perpetual surprise. The breath of air that greeted us carried the distinctive chill of stone and earth, tinged with something more unsettling. The grim discovery, Mrs. Evelyn Reed, lay within the stone chamber with an arrangement that spoke of careful placement rather than hasty concealment. She wore her traveling costume from the previous day, though now it bore the unmistakable signs of violence. Dark stains that Dr. Hartwell immediately identified as blood, and tears in the fabric that suggested struggle or rough handling. More significantly, draped around her shoulders was a coarse woolen cloak that clearly did not belong to her wardrobe. The fabric matched perfectly the threads Poirot had discovered on the bedroom windowsill, finally connecting the staged disappearance with the actual crime. "She has been dead since yesterday evening," Dr. Hartwell confirmed after his preliminary examination. "The cause appears to be a severe blow to the head, though the weapon is not immediately apparent. The body was moved here after death. The blood patterns make that quite clear." Poirot's methodical analysis. Hercule Poirot's examination of the scene demonstrated the methodical precision that had made his reputation. His small hands moved with surgical care as he catalogued each detail, his keen eyes missing nothing that might illuminate the truth. "Observe, mes amis," he said, his voice carrying new gravity. "The positioning tells us much. She lies as though sleeping, hands folded, expression peaceful despite the violence of her death. This is not the work of passion or panic, but of someone who retained sufficient composure to arrange the scene with care." More revealing still was his discovery of Mrs. Reed's jewelry. The pieces scattered about the icehouse floor, emeralds, diamonds, pearls, proved upon examination to be the same paste replicas found in her room. The genuine articles, worth a fortune, remained hidden in her traveling cases at the manor. "Someone has been systematically replacing Mrs. Reed's valuable jewelry with expert forgeries," Poirot announced. "This was not the work of days, but of weeks, perhaps months. We are dealing with a mind that plans extensively and executes with precision." The portfolio revelation. Miss Fairfax, summoned to identify certain documents found in Mrs. Reed's reticule, provided the most damaging testimony yet. Under Poirot's gentle but persistent questioning, she revealed the contents of her carefully guarded portfolio, shared draft documents for a charitable trust that would have transformed several lives forever. Mrs. Reed intended to make restitution, Miss Fairfax explained through tears, her usual composure finally shattered by the reality of her employer's death. She had discovered irregularities in various financial dealings. Not just Charles's gambling debts, but systematic embezzlement from Lord Ashworth's estate accounts. More shocking still was the revelation of Mrs. Reed's knowledge of the jewelry substitution scheme. She had been aware of the forgeries for weeks, Miss Fairfax continued. Rather than expose the thief immediately, she chose to gather evidence methodically. She planned to offer the opportunity for voluntary confession and restitution rather than public scandal. The narrowing circle. The implications of these revelations sent shockwaves through our assembled company. Charles Pemberton's face had drained of all color, while his wife Constance maintained her mask of composure with visible effort. The financial motives that had seemed abstract suddenly became concrete and devastating. "The trust documents," Poirot observed with quiet significance, "name specific beneficiaries who would receive compensation for losses suffered through embezzlement and theft. Someone could not allow these arrangements to proceed. Professor Finch, whose earlier arrest had seemed so conclusive, was quietly released as his alibi proved unshakable. Lord Ashworth's detailed testimony about their continuous conversation during the crucial hours made his involvement impossible. The real killer remained among us, their identity hidden beneath layers of social respectability and carefully constructed alibis. The psychological landscape. As dawn approached, Poirot gathered us in the morning room for what he termed a clarification of positions. His manner had grown more serious, the theatrical elements of his personality replaced by quiet, inexorable authority. "We have here," he announced, "not a crime of passion, but a calculated elimination. Mrs. Reed's plan to make restitution threatened to expose financial crimes that had remained hidden for years. Someone chose murder over confession, using her own staged disappearance as cover for the deed. The coarse woolen cloak found with the body proved to belong to the manor's household, a servant's winter garment that had been appropriated to create the false evidence at the bedroom window. The killer had access to the house, knowledge of its routines, and the calculating intelligence to orchestrate an elaborate deception. The final pressure. "The net tightens," Poirot concluded, his green eyes surveying our small company with the intensity of a predator selecting prey. Physical evidence, financial motive, and opportunity now point toward a single individual. The paste jewelry scheme required months of planning and access to the victim's private possessions. The murder itself required intimate knowledge of the manor's layout and Mrs. Reed's intended movements. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over our gathering like a shroud. "Tomorrow we shall conclude this affair. I advise everyone to spend tonight in careful reflection upon the choices that have brought us to this point. The truth, as it always does, will emerge, and with it, justice for the woman who never took her seat at dinner." As the October dawn broke over Ashworth Manor's ancient stones, we all understood that the final act of this deadly drama was about to commence. The psychological campaign that Hercule Poirot had waged with such precision had achieved its purpose. The killer stood exposed in all but name, their elaborate deception unraveled thread by thread through the inexorable application of logic to human nature's darkest impulses. The woman who had collected secrets like trophies had finally encountered someone whose secret was worth killing to protect, and now that same secret would prove to be their undoing. The pale October dawn found Hercule Poirot in his most methodical mood, moving through Ashworth Manor's corridors with the measured precision of a clockmaker adjusting the final mechanism of an intricate timepiece. The discovery in the ice house had transformed his investigation from a puzzle of disappearance into the systematic unraveling of a carefully orchestrated murder, and his little gray cells had begun to perceive the true architecture of the crime. The key to everything. "Pembleton," Poirot said quietly, encountering the butler in the servants' hall as the household began its morning routines. "The keys to the ice house? They are kept where, precisely?" The elderly servant, his composure somewhat restored by the familiar rhythms of duty, indicated a locked cabinet near the butler's pantry. "In the plate safe, sir, with the other estate keys. The large iron key with the distinctive bow has served the ice house these 40 years. Poirot examined the ancient key with intense concentration, his magnifying glass revealing details that had escaped casual observation. "Most interesting," he murmured, indicating fresh scratches on the metal surface. "This key has been used recently. See how the iron shows bright where fingers have gripped it, how the ward shows new wear against the lock mechanism." When pressed for details, Pembleton's memory proved crucial. "Mrs. Pemberton requested the estate keys last week, sir. She wished to show the ice house to some visiting friends. A matter of family history," she said. I accompanied her to unlock it, then secured it again, immediately. The servant's crucial testimony. Mary, the housemaid whose discovery had initiated our investigation, provided even more damaging testimony when questioned privately. Her nervous energy had given way to the relief of unburdening herself of troubling observations. "Mrs. Pemberton was in Mrs. Reed's room yesterday afternoon, sir," she confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "She asked me for pins, saying the shoulder seam of the evening gown needed adjustment. She seemed quite agitated, sir, not her usual composed self." More significantly, Mary revealed Constance's familiarity with the household's winter clothing. "She had sent the old servant's cloak to be brushed just last week, sir. Said it was needed for estate rounds when the weather turned. We didn't notice it missing from the press until after we found Mrs. Reed." The fight, financial web exposed. Lord Ashworth's estate ledgers, examined with Poirot's characteristic thoroughness, revealed a pattern of systematic manipulation that transformed our understanding of the financial pressures at work. The massive volumes showed entries in multiple hands, with corrections that spoke of careful concealment. "Observe, Hastings," Poirot said, his finger tracing alterations in the account books. "The original entries in one hand, then corrections in another. See how the figures are first diminished, then restored. The continental style of penmanship in the corrections, the precise formation of numbers designed to disguise rather than clarify." The pattern was unmistakable. Estate accounts had been systematically altered to conceal substantial withdrawals, with the corrections designed to present different figures to different audiences. Someone with intimate access to the household's financial records had been conducting a sophisticated embezzlement scheme over many months. The physical evidence accumulates. In Constance's private sitting room, Poirot discovered a stick of sealing wax in an unusual olive-green shade that matched precisely with fragments found among Mrs. Reed's correspondence. More damning still was his examination of her sewing basket, which revealed threads that corresponded exactly to those found on the bedroom windowsill. "The needlework tells its own story," Poirot observed, examining the precise stitching on various household items. "These hands are accustomed to delicate work, to the creation of convincing repairs and alterations. The jewelry substitutions required not merely access, but considerable skill with settings and clasps." The psychological portrait. As the morning progressed, Poirot's analysis revealed the psychological landscape that had made murder seem preferable to exposure. The killer possessed a particular combination of traits: meticulous attention to detail, fierce pride in social position, and the calculating intelligence to orchestrate complex deceptions over extended periods. "We are dealing with someone whose entire existence depends upon the maintenance of appearances," Poirot announced to me as we walked the manor's grounds. The jewelry thefts were not impulsive crimes, but systematic acquisitions, each piece carefully replaced with expert forgeries. When Mrs. Reed discovered the scheme and offered restitution rather than prosecution, it should have been salvation. But pride made confession impossible. The hidden letter revealed Miss Fairfax, her composure finally shattered by the weight of her knowledge, provided the final piece of Poirot's puzzle. The letter she had concealed in her portfolio revealed Mrs. Reed's complete awareness of the financial crimes and her plan to offer private resolution. "She knew everything," Miss Fairfax confessed through tears. "The jewelry substitutions, the estate account, manipulations, even the gambling debts that had made Charles vulnerable to exploitation. She planned to provide the money for complete restitution and then disappear herself, allowing everyone to save face." The letter, written in Mrs. Reed's distinctive hand, outlined her intention to confront the perpetrator privately, offering them the choice between voluntary confession with financial assistance or public exposure with criminal prosecution. It was an act of remarkable generosity that had ultimately cost her life. The pressure intensifies. Armed with this overwhelming evidence, Poirot orchestrated what could only be described as a campaign of psychological pressure. He arranged seemingly casual encounters that allowed him to observe reactions to carefully chosen remarks, staged conversations that revealed guilty knowledge, and created situations where the killer's composure began to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence. "The net tightens," he announced to our assembled company as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Physical evidence, financial motive, and psychological analysis now converge upon a single point. The killer's greatest strength, their meticulous attention to detail, has become their fatal weakness. In creating such an elaborate deception, they have left traces that only the most careful examination could reveal. The promise of resolution. As evening approached, Poirot's manner grew more serious, the theatrical elements of his personality replaced by quiet, inexorable authority. The evidence he had gathered throughout the day, the icehouse key, the servant testimonies, the financial records, the physical traces, formed a web of proof that would soon ensnare the killer completely. "Tomorrow morning," he announced with characteristic precision, "we shall gather in the morning room for the final revelation. I advise everyone to spend tonight in careful reflection upon the choices that have brought us to this point. The truth, as it always does, will emerge with the dawn, and with it, justice for the woman who never took her seat at dinner." The hidden clue that Hercule Poirot had discovered was not a single piece of evidence, but the convergence of multiple threads that revealed the killer's identity with mathematical certainty. The meticulous nature that had made the crime possible had also made its solution inevitable, and the final act of this deadly drama was about to commence. In the gathering darkness of Ashworth Manor, we all understood that the psychological campaign Poirot had waged with such precision was approaching its climax. The killer, their elaborate deception systematically dismantled, faced a choice between confession and the complete exposure of their carefully constructed lies. The woman who had collected secrets like trophies had finally encountered someone whose secret was worth killing to protect, and that same secret would prove to be their undoing. The morning room at Ashworth Manor had been transformed into a theatre of justice, its pale paneling and serene proportions seeming almost indecently calm in the face of what was about to unfold. Hercule Poirot stood before the hearth with his hands folded, the very picture of composed authority. At his suggestion, an empty chair had been placed among us, draped with the coarse servant's cloak recovered from the icehouse, creating a silent, accusatory presence that dominated our small gathering like an actor's prop upon a stage. The stage for truth. Every member of our household had been summoned with mathematical precision. Lady Ashworth maintained her aristocratic bearing despite the strain etched around her eyes, while Lord Ashworth sat grave and silent, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. Charles Pemberton appeared pale and trembling, his earlier bravado dissolved entirely under the weight of accumulated guilt. His wife Constance occupied her chair with characteristic elegant posture, though I observed how her fingers worked continuously at her pearl necklace, and her dark eyes held a calculating wariness that suggested a mind preparing for battle. Dr. Hartwell possessed the patient dignity of one who had witnessed many human tragedies, while Professor Finch, recently exonerated, watched with the intense focus of a scholar observing a fascinating but disturbing experiment. Miss Fairfax clutched her portfolio with exhausted resignation, and Sir Geoffrey Thorne, his diplomatic composure restored, nevertheless showed strain around his eyes. Inspector Morrison had positioned himself strategically near the door. Poirot's methodical reconstruction. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "you will forgive me if I speak at length. It is necessary to put the play upon its feet, with each entrance and exit as it occurred. We have had the acts out of order. Now we restore them to their proper sequence." He moved with characteristic precision, his keen eyes surveying our assembled company. Mrs. Evelyn Reed came to Ashworth Manor not merely as a social guest, but as an agent of restitution. She had discovered financial crimes conducted with remarkable sophistication over many months. estate account manipulations that required intimate knowledge of Lord Ashworth's arrangements, and jewelry substitutions executed with such skill that she herself remained unaware of the thefts for considerable time. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the steady ticking of the mantelpiece clock and Charles Pemberton's labored breathing. The false timeline. Exposed. At 7:07, Poirot continued with methodical precision, a telephone call is placed from the village call box by Sir Geoffrey Thorne at the request of Madame Reed. This we know. But it is not the deception of the guilty. It is the camouflage of a woman who intends to vanish for an hour without questions, to keep an appointment of delicacy. The message serves two purposes: to excuse her absence from dinner, and to lay a false trail suggesting delay on the London road. His hand drew a neat arc in the air. At 5 o'clock, she is seen in the long gallery by Mademoiselle Fairfax. After that, she goes to her room, attends to correspondence, burns a letter that has disturbed her greatly. But someone else has plans for this evening, someone who cannot allow Mrs. Reed to proceed with her intention to settle old accounts through generous restitution rather than public exposure. The physical evidence converges. Moving to his prepared materials, Poirot displayed the estate ledgers with their telltale corrections. Observe the handwriting, mes amis. The original entries in Lord Ashworth's familiar hand, then corrections in another. See how the figures are first diminished, then restored. The continental style of penmanship in the corrections, the precise formation of numbers designed to disguise rather than clarify. He withdrew an evidence envelope containing fabric threads. The needlework tells its own story. These hands are accustomed to delicate work, to the creation of convincing repairs and alterations. The jewelry substitutions required not merely access, but considerable skill with settings and clasps. Work that took months to complete. More damning still was the sealing wax evidence. Wax of an unusual olive-green shade, found among Mrs. Reed's correspondence and matching precisely with supplies discovered in a particular household sitting room. The ice-house key, bearing fresh fingerprints from someone who had borrowed it last week under pretense of showing the structure to visitors. The systematic elimination. Let us eliminate the impossible, Poirot announced with quiet authority. Professor Finch, released, his alibi unshakable and his temperament unsuited to such elaborate deception. Sir Geoffrey Thorne, complicit in foolishness perhaps, but his are the skills of diplomacy, not of ledgers and needlework. Dr. Hartwell, his hands are gentle, his opportunity limited, his character beyond reproach. His gaze moved systematically across our company. Lord Ashworth possesses knowledge of his estate, certainly, but lacks both the vanity that rejects generous confession terms and the physical capability to transport a body to the ice-house. Charles Pemberton. You have been foolish with gambling, desperate with debts, but your vices are of impulse, not the patient sophistication required for months of systematic theft. Charles had begun weeping quietly, his composure finally shattered. I never meant... The debts spiraled beyond control, but I never touched the jewelry, never altered the accounts. That wasn't me. The psychological portrait. Non, mon ami, Poirot said gently. You lack the sophistication for such elaborate financial crimes. The true perpetrator required a unique combination of traits: meticulous attention to detail, fierce pride in social position, and the calculating intelligence to orchestrate complex deceptions over extended periods. His eyes settled with inexorable finality upon Constance Pemberton, someone whose continental education provided the penmanship skills necessary for account alterations, someone whose access to estate records through marriage gave intimate knowledge of financial arrangements. Someone whose skills with needle and thread are evident throughout this household. Someone whose pride made confession impossible, even when offered the most generous terms. The moment of accusation. The crime itself reveals the killer's psychology. Poirot continued relentlessly. Mrs. Reed's staged disappearance, the open window, the carefully placed blood drops, the coarse wool threads, all theatrical elements designed to misdirect suspicion. But the killer could not resist improving the deception, planting evidence to implicate the innocent Professor Finch. Constance's mask of composure had begun to crack, revealing beneath it a mind of remarkable calculation pushed to desperate measures. "You cannot prove any of this," she said quietly, her voice carrying new steel. "Circumstantial evidence and psychological speculation—" "Ah, but madame," Poirot interrupted with his characteristic small smile, "we have far more than speculation. Last night I placed a sealed envelope upon the hall table, addressed to the person who knows. It contained blank paper, nothing more. This morning, the seal had been microscopically disturbed and reset. Only someone familiar with the delicate art of warming wax just enough to reseat an impression without cracking the film could accomplish such work. The complete revelation. When Mrs. Reed discovered your systematic theft of her jewelry and embezzlement from the estate accounts, she offered private restitution rather than prosecution," Poirot concluded with quiet finality. "It should have been salvation. But pride made confession impossible. You arranged to meet her privately, ostensibly to discuss terms. Instead, you struck her down and staged the elaborate disappearance to misdirect suspicion. The revelation was devastating in its completeness. The paste jewelry, the altered accounts, the icehouse key, the servant's cloak, every element of the deception had been orchestrated by someone whose entire existence depended upon maintaining the facade of respectability and social position. The final confrontation. Constance Pemberton's composure dissolved entirely, revealing the twisted logic that had made murder seem preferable to exposure. "She would have destroyed everything," she whispered, her voice carrying terrible justification. "Our position, our future, she would have taken it all away with her. Sanctimonious offer of restitution." As Inspector Morrison stepped forward with handcuffs, Constance's final words revealed the depth of her delusion. "Some things are worth more than life itself: reputation, position, the respect of society. I would do it again." Justice served. The woman who never took her seat at dinner had finally received justice, though the price would echo through Ashworth Manor's halls for years to come. In that moment of triumph, I saw in Poirot's eyes not satisfaction, but profound sadness, the melancholy recognition that human nature, in its darkest manifestations, could transform social pride into murderous desperation. "And so," Poirot concluded softly, "we have our answer. The empty chair at dinner belonged not to a woman who vanished mysteriously into the October night, but to one who died because someone's pride could not accept the generous terms of forgiveness." The final gathering had served its purpose, the truth revealed through the inexorable application of logic to human psychology's most complex motivations. The case of the woman who never took her seat at dinner was closed, leaving us to contemplate the terrible lengths to which people will go to protect their carefully constructed lives from the consequences of their own choices. The morning room at Ashworth Manor had been transformed into a theatre of justice, its elegant proportions seeming almost indecently serene in the face of what was about to unfold. Hercule Poirot stood before the assembled company with characteristic precision, his small hands folded, his keen eyes surveying each face with the methodical attention of a conductor preparing his final movement. "The systematic revelation, Mesdames et Messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We have reached the moment when all deceptions must fall away, like autumn leaves, revealing the stark branches of truth beneath. Mrs. Evelyn Reed came to this house not merely as a social guest, but as an agent of redemption, offering forgiveness where others would have demanded justice, restitution where others would have sought revenge." He gestured toward the empty chair that dominated our gathering, draped now with a coarse servant's cloak recovered from the ice house. The woman who never took her seat at dinner died because someone's pride could not accept the generous terms of forgiveness. Let us examine how that pride transformed generosity into the catalyst for murder. Moving with characteristic precision, Poirot displayed the estate ledgers with their telltale corrections. Observe the handwriting, the original entries in Lord Ashworth's familiar hand, then corrections in another. The continental style of penmanship, the precise formation of numbers designed to disguise rather than clarify. Someone with access to these records through marriage, someone whose European education provided the necessary skills for such sophisticated financial deception. The physical evidence converges. The jewelry substitutions, Poirot continued, withdrawing the paste replicas from their evidence envelope, required months of meticulous work, each piece carefully removed, expertly copied, then replaced with such skill that even the owner remained unaware of the theft. This was not the crude work of a desperate amateur, but the calculated artistry of someone whose needlework skills are evident throughout this household. His attention turned to more damning evidence. The icehouse key, bearing fresh fingerprints from someone who had borrowed it last week under pretense of showing the structure to visitors. The servant's cloak, appropriated to create false evidence at the bedroom window. The sealing wax of unusual olive green shade, matching supplies discovered in a particular sitting room. Pausing before a small bronze object on the side table, Poirot's expression grew more grave. And here, the murder weapon itself. This bronze doorstop shaped like a pineapple, which yesterday stood at an angle to the skirting. This morning, returned to its proper position by hands that hoped it would not be noticed. Around the base, one minute filament of pale hair with a reddish glint. Mrs. Reed's own. The edges show the slightest bruising where flesh met metal with fatal force. The confrontation. As the evidence mounted with inexorable precision, Constance Pemberton's carefully maintained composure began to show hairline cracks. Her fingers worked continuously at her pearl necklace, her dark eyes holding a calculating wariness that suggested a mind preparing for battle. "You accuse me based on circumstantial evidence," she said, her voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "Handwriting analysis, disturbed seals, household access. These prove nothing definitive." "Ah, but madame," Poirot replied with his characteristic small smile, "it is precisely the accumulation of such details that creates certainty. Each piece of evidence is like a note in a musical composition, individually unremarkable, but together forming an unmistakable melody of guilt." He moved closer, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "Last night I placed a sealed envelope upon the hall table, addressed to the person who knows. It contained nothing but blank paper. This morning the seal had been microscopically disturbed and reset. Only someone familiar with the delicate art of warming wax, just enough to reseat an impression without cracking, the film could accomplish such work. Someone whose expertise with jewelry settings had provided extensive practice with such techniques. The psychological unraveling. The revelation struck Constance like a physical blow. Her mask of composure cracked entirely, revealing beneath it the twisted logic that had made murder seem preferable to accepting generous terms of forgiveness. She would have destroyed everything, Constance whispered, her voice carrying terrible justification. Our position, our future, our reputation in society. Her sanctimonious offer of restitution was just another form of control, another way to hold power over us. I couldn't allow that humiliation. "But madame," Poirot said gently, "Mrs. Reed offered you salvation without scandal. Her letter, which Miss Fairfax has courageously revealed, outlined complete financial restitution and absolute discretion. She sought to heal rather than harm, to restore rather than destroy." Constance's final words revealed the depth of her delusion. Some things are worth more than life itself. Reputation, position, the respect of society. She threatened all of that with her generous terms that would have mocked us forever as objects of her charity. The arrest and immediate aftermath. As Inspector Morrison stepped forward with handcuffs, the transformation of our genteel gathering into a scene of criminal justice was complete. Charles Pemberton had collapsed entirely. His earlier bravado dissolved into helpless weeping as he grappled with the extent of his wife's deception. "I knew about the gambling debts," he sobbed. "But the jewelry, the estate accounts. I swear I had no knowledge. She told me she was managing our finances, finding ways to economize." Lady Ashworth maintained her aristocratic bearing despite the strain, while Lord Ashworth sat in stunned silence, contemplating the systematic plundering of his estate accounts. The financial damage could eventually be repaired through Mrs. Reed's considerable estate, but the psychological wounds would prove more enduring. The practical resolutions. In the hours that followed, Poirot demonstrated his characteristic attention to the practical consequences of justice. Working with Lady Ashworth in the study, he drafted arrangements for Mrs. Reed's intended trusts and restitutions, ensuring that her generous intentions would be honored despite her tragic death. Miss Fairfax, pale but steady now that duty presented itself clearly, offered to place all of Mrs. Reed's papers before the proper authorities. "She always kept duplicates by hand," she said quietly. "She never trusted the post entirely. There is enough documentation to honor all her intentions." Professor Finch, his earlier mortification at being falsely accused, now transformed into gratitude, approached Poirot with humble appreciation. "If there is anything I can do to make amends for my behavior under suspicion—" "There is," Poirot replied with gentleness. "You will go to your trustees, not to the newspapers, and arrange proper governance that protects scholarly zeal from the seductions of finance. Mrs. Reed would have admired order, not scandal." The deeper truth revealed. As evening approached and the legal machinery began its inexorable process, Poirot gathered the remaining company for his final observations. His manner had grown contemplative, the theatrical elements of his personality replaced by profound philosophical reflection. "Consider the terrible irony," he said softly, adjusting the remaining chairs until perfect symmetry was achieved. Mrs. Reed's will, which we have now examined, contained provisions for exactly the kind of generous restitution she had offered in life. Charles's gambling debts would have been cleared, the estate accounts made whole, the jewelry thefts forgiven, all without public scandal or criminal prosecution. He paused, allowing the full weight of this revelation to settle over our company. She died because someone's pride could not accept forgiveness. The very generosity that should have saved them all became the catalyst for murder. It is perhaps the most tragic irony I've encountered in all my years of criminal investigation. Mrs. Reed's prescient words. Miss Fairfax approached with a small envelope, her expression grave. "There is one final letter, Monsieur Poirot, written before we came down from London, as though she sensed what might occur." Poirot read the brief message in silence before passing it to me. In Mrs. Reed's firm handwriting was a note of gratitude for past services, and a single line that might have served as her epitaph. "If you should find yourself called upon to tidy after me, I beg that you do so with kindness." "We will," Poirot said simply. We have. The final departure. As our motor car prepared for the journey back to London, Poirot paused on the threshold of Ashworth Manor, looking back along the corridor with its polished floors and aligned portraits. The empty chair from our final gathering had been removed, yet its absence seemed as significant as its presence had been. "What will you remember of this case?" I asked as we settled into our seats. He adjusted his hat with characteristic precision before answering. "A chair that was empty, mon ami. And yet it was not the seat at table that mattered, but the place a woman had made in the lives around her. One was claimed by pride and is now vacant forever. The other, made by generosity, will not remain empty long." As the manor's windows glowed like a constellation in the gathering darkness, Poirot permitted himself the smallest sigh. Pride, Hastings, is perhaps the most dangerous of all human emotions. It can transform love into hate, generosity into threat, and forgiveness into the very catalyst for murder itself. In the name of order, Constance Pemberton created the most terrible disorder, a perversion of everything I hold dear about the methodical mind. The philosophical conclusion. Consider, he continued as the ancient stones of Ashworth Manor disappeared behind us, how Mrs. Reed collected secrets not as weapons, but as opportunities for redemption. She offered each person the chance to make amends, privately, to restore what had been taken without the harsh glare of public judgment. It was an act of remarkable grace that should have healed rather than destroyed. His final words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom about human nature's capacity for both extraordinary generosity and devastating evil. The woman who never took her seat at dinner has finally found her rest, not at our table, but in the justice that her death has ultimately served. And we who remain must carry forward her example of choosing forgiveness over revenge, healing over harm. As the countryside rolled past our windows, I reflected on the profound lesson we had learned. The empty place setting that had begun our mystery had revealed not just a crime, but a fundamental truth about the human condition, that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness can provoke the most desperate acts of evil, and that pride, unchecked by humility, can transform even the most refined individuals into calculating killers. The case was closed, but its echoes would resonate for years to come, a reminder that beneath the veneer of civilized society lie passions and desperations capable of the most shocking crimes, and that justice, when finally served, carries with it both satisfaction and profound sadness for the waste of human potential that crime represents. In the end, Hercule Poirot had not merely solved a murder. He had illuminated the complex interplay of human nature, pride, and the terrible consequences that can flow from an inability to accept grace when it is offered freely and without condition. The morning room at Ashworth Manor had witnessed the final act of our tragic drama, yet the echo of Constance Pemberton's defiant words, "Some things are worth more than life itself," lingered in the air like incense from a perverted altar. As Inspector Morrison led her away in handcuffs, her elegant posture remained unbroken, chin lifted with the same pride that had driven her to murder. She walked as though attending a tiresome social obligation rather than facing the gallows, her gloves immaculate, her composure a final testament to the very vanity that had destroyed her. The immediate reckoning. The transformation that followed was both swift and profound. Charles Pemberton collapsed entirely, his earlier bravado dissolved into the helpless weeping of a man confronting the extent of his own willful blindness. Dr. Hartwell attended him with characteristic gentleness, prescribing rest and the gradual acceptance of truths too overwhelming to absorb at once. She managed everything. Charles repeated with the stunned bewilderment of a child, discovering that trusted adults have been systematically deceiving him. The household accounts, our social calendar, even my correspondence with creditors. I thought she was protecting me from financial complexities and helping me focus on other pursuits. His voice carried the hollow ring of a man, confronting the terrible price of his own moral cowardice. Lady Ashworth moved through the crisis with the stoic efficiency that 3 decades of managing a great household had instilled in her. Yet I observed how her hands trembled slightly as she directed the practical arrangements. Letters to solicitors, instructions to staff, quiet preparations to minimize the scandal that would inevitably follow. Lord Ashworth spent long hours in his library, examining the ledgers that had betrayed both his finances and his trust, his weathered face bearing the weight of violated confidence. Mrs. Reed's extraordinary final act. The reading of Evelyn Reed's will, conducted by her London solicitor, who arrived with urgent haste, provided the most remarkable revelation of our entire affair. The document, revised just days before her death, demonstrated a prescience that bordered on the supernatural and a generosity that shamed us all. She has left specific bequests for Charles Pemberton's gambling debts. The solicitor announced to our assembled company, his voice carrying professional amazement. The full amount, with interest, to be paid directly to his creditors. Additionally, she has established a trust fund to compensate Lord Ashworth for any irregularities discovered in his estate accounts. More extraordinarily still, she had provided for her own murderer's defense. A sum of £5,000 is designated for legal representation, with the specific instruction that it be used to secure the most competent counsel available, regardless of the defendant's guilt or innocence. Miss Fairfax wept openly at this final demonstration of her employer's extraordinary character. She knew, she whispered through her tears. Somehow she knew what would happen, and she arranged for mercy, even toward the person who would destroy her. The systematic restoration. Under Poirot's methodical supervision, the process of restoration began immediately. Each piece of stolen jewelry was catalogued and valued, with arrangements made through London's finest craftsmen to replace the paste replicas with authentic stones. The work required considerable expertise, but Mrs. Reed's estate bore every expense without strain. The estate accounts demanded more complex attention. Poirot worked closely with Lord Ashworth's legitimate accountants, tracing each altered entry back to its original form. The pattern of systematic embezzlement, conducted over nearly 2 years, represented a masterwork of financial deception that had required considerable intelligence and patience. "Observe the continental penmanship," Poirot explained, indicating the subtle alterations in the ledgers. The precise formation of numbers designed to disguise rather than clarify. Someone whose European education provided the necessary skills for such sophisticated deception, combined with intimate access through marriage to the household's most sensitive financial records. Character transformations. Professor Finch, his earlier humiliation transformed into grateful determination, approached the reorganization of his archaeological foundation with newfound wisdom. "I shall establish oversight committees and transparent accounting procedures," he declared with the fervor of a convert. "Mrs. Reed's trust in scholarly endeavor will be honored through proper governance that protects research from the temptations of financial irregularity." Charles Pemberton's path forward proved more complex. The revelation of his wife's crimes had shattered not merely his understanding of their marriage, but his fundamental grasp of reality itself. Yet beneath the wreckage of his illusions, something resembling genuine character began to emerge. "I must learn to face reality without the cushion of self-deception," he confided to Poirot during one of our final conversations at the Manor. "My wife's crimes began with my own moral cowardice. I cannot change the past, but I can ensure that such willful blindness never again creates the conditions for tragedy." Miss Fairfax, inheriting both a substantial bequest and the responsibility for managing Mrs. Reed's charitable foundations, underwent perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. Her nervous energy, previously channeled into anxious service, now found purpose in continuing her employer's work of quiet generosity. The philosophical implications. As the immediate crisis gave way to the slower work of healing, Poirot's observations revealed the deeper meanings embedded in our tragic affair. "We have witnessed," he reflected, "how the most refined education and elevated social position can coexist with the capacity for systematic evil. But we have also seen how genuine nobility of character can transcend death itself, continuing to work for healing and restoration even after the grave has claimed its owner." The psychological landscape that Dr. Hartwell helped us understand proved equally illuminating. Constance possessed what we might term a compartmentalized mind, he explained during one of our evening discussions. She could conduct systematic theft while maintaining genuine affection for her victims, could plan murder while preserving social courtesies. Yet her final breakdown revealed the terrible strain such deception had imposed upon her psyche. The return to order. In the days that followed, Ashworth Manor gradually resumed its rhythms, though with a different quality to its silence. Less suspense, more absence. The empty chair from our final gathering had been removed, yet its absence seemed as significant as its presence had been. Pembleton performed his duties with a dignity that was almost sacramental, while the household staff moved with the careful respect of those who had witnessed tragedy transform their familiar world. The formal gardens, with their topiary yews, marching in impeccable ranks and borders, maintaining their muted autumn splendor, seemed to reassert the possibility of order after chaos. Poirot, observing a small stone that had strayed from the edge of a path, adjusted it with fastidious care. "You see," he said quietly, "order reasserts itself. It is not the same order as yesterday, perhaps, but it is order nonetheless." The final departure. As we prepared for our own departure, Lady Ashworth approached us with visible emotion, her usual composure finally wavering. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "it is not merely that you have found the truth. You have given us a manner of bearing it. That is rarer, and it is kinder." "Madame," he replied with characteristic gallantry, "the truth without kindness is a scalpel in the hand of a child. It cuts, yes, but it does not heal." Our motor car waited in the drive as the October afternoon light slanted through ancient oaks. In the compartment of the London train, Poirot arranged his hat and gloves with ceremonious care and gazed out upon the receding countryside. "She never took her seat at dinner," I observed, half to myself, recalling the gleaming crystal and untouched napkin that had begun our investigation. "And yet, in a sense, she presided over every course thereafter." "Exactement," he murmured, his green eyes thoughtful. "It is not always the person present who governs an evening, but the one whose idea governs the minds of those present. Her idea was restitution in private, healing rather than harm. It was a good idea that frightened a soul too dependent on its own reflection, when one must choose between the true self and the mirror's image. Eh bien, some choose the reflection, and then all the world shatters. The lasting legacy." As the countryside unfolded in its orderly fields and hedgerows, indifferent to human catastrophes, Poirot's final observations proved prophetic. The case had revealed fundamental truths about human nature that transcended its specific circumstances, how pride can become a form of madness when it encounters threats to its fundamental assumptions, how the most generous gestures can provoke the most desperate responses, and how justice, when finally served, carries with it both satisfaction and profound sadness for the waste of human potential that crime represents. The woman who never took her seat at dinner had, through her death, created a legacy of generosity that would outlive all of us. Her final act of providing for her own murderer's defense represented a form of grace that challenged conventional understanding of justice itself, transforming tragedy into an opportunity for redemption and ensuring that even in death, the generous heart continues its work of healing. "Come," Poirot said finally, straightening a crease in his cuff with the air of a man restoring order to his small corner of the world. "In London there is a restaurant where they keep the napkins for regular clients, folded with their names. It is an excellent custom. It implies continuity, the proper taking of one's place. We will dine there, mon ami, and occupy our rightful seats." "And Mrs. Reed?" I asked quietly. He looked at me with infinite gentleness. "For Madame Reed, there will be other tables, those of the lives she has set in order through her final generosity. It is enough, and it is everything." So concluded the affair of the woman who never took her seat at dinner, a crime arranged like an elaborate place-setting, solved by a mind that prizes the symmetry of truth above the show of appearances, and resolved through the extraordinary grace of a victim whose final act was to ensure that justice would be tempered with mercy. The empty chair had been filled not by physical presence, but by the enduring influence of a character so remarkable that even murder could not diminish its power to transform lives, heal the wounds that pride and desperation had inflicted upon the human heart.